About a month ago, bodice ripper Regency fantasy Bridgerton hit the small screens and the YouTube costume community lost their collective minds. There's been a lot said about this series, some of it's serious. There's a video from Muse and Dionysus and also the panel discussion hosted on Costuming Drama's channel that have a lot of really important things to say about race, how it's handled in the series. But let's be honest, quite a lot of them are about the costumes. Some people hate them, some people love them, a lot of people have strong opinions on Penelope Featherington. It sparked a whole big conversation about fantasy versus historical accuracy, creativity, what we value in costuming as viewers and creators, and it's inspired a lot of people to create their own cosplay or inspired Bridgerton costume. Only almost all these videos have one thing in common. They only talk about half the cast. Now in fairness, Zach Pinsent did do a video about the men's costumes in Bridgerton, but he only really, in his own words, discussed whether or not they were historically accurate, not whether or not they were good. And I'm here to tell you that for a variety of quite complex and interesting reasons, particularly in the context of the show as a whole, they're garbage. Some disclaimers. 1. There will be major spoilers for the series from the outset. 2. We're going to be talking about gender and sexuality, including but not limited to female desire, toxic masculinity, queerness and depictions of queerness in media, and transgender experiences. If this is not your jam, that is your signal to leave. If you have a strong desire to express your displeasure that these are subjects I am discussing, or you think that this is an airport and you have to announce your departure, do not under any circumstances put that in the comments. Decent normal people have to read those. 3. This is indeed a video that could be summed up as, but what about the men's? I will not be discussing the female characters or female characters' costumes except by comparison. If you're not interested in that, no worries. There are literally dozens of other videos for you to watch. I'll even include a playlist in the description which has lots of videos about Bridgerton costumes, character analysis, the show itself, everything you could want. Setting the stage, what is Bridgerton and who is its audience? Bridgerton is not a traditional costume drama or historical story. The show is an alternate universe fantasy where attitudes towards race and skin colour are significantly different from what they historically were, and it's based on a series of romance novels which have already taken some liberties with the historical realities of the Regency period in order to tell engaging stories of romance and passion. For example, all-female gambling parties probably weren't a thing, but it's a really cool scene, it develops some characters and it helps move the story along in an interesting way. The important takeaway here is that historical accuracy has already been well sacrificed on the altar of good storytelling, and but it's historically accurate is not going to fly as a justification for any of the things I'm going to discuss. If it is historically accurate, a decision was made for that specific detail to be historically accurate, and other options were always available. While I love romance novels and genuinely believe that everyone can and should enjoy them, it's kind of inescapable that the main audience for these stories is women. I would actually even narrow that down further to women who love men. The core theme of every traditional romance novel boils down to female desire, overwhelmingly for men, whether that's romantic or sexual or both. It's important to hold that in mind as we look at how the men in Bridgerton are depicted, because we're often not looking at men as main characters and agents in the story in their own right. The men we are seeing are expressly presented as men for women to desire. Or not. It's also important to remember that some of these men are explicitly men you, the female audience, should not desire, and that's going to get real relevant in just a minute. Setting the stage, part 2, the costumes. A big deal has been made out of the costumes for this series. On the one hand, yes, organically fans in the costuming world has reacted and responded to these costumes, but they were always supposed to. I think it's important to recognise that the people making Bridgerton wanted the costumes to have a massive impact. They've released behind-the-scenes details talking about their process, their design intent, how and why they've deviated from the historical norms. We've been given every indication that they've thought long and hard about every design choice in the costuming department, and been explicitly told that almost every major item was specifically made for this production. They have given themselves nowhere to hide. If a character is wearing something in Bridgerton, it's because the people making the show absolutely consciously wanted them to be. They have also, somewhat less explicitly, made it pretty clear that they think costume is a girl thing. There is a 4-minute behind-the-scenes video called Costumes of Bridgerton, which I have watched frankly too many times by this point. All of the actors interviewed in this video are playing female characters. All of the costumes you see featured or see people working on in this video, without exception, are women's costumes. Even in the clips from the show that they have chosen to intercut with the interviews, I counted more than double the number of women than men, and that was with me counting every single footman as a distinct character, even though they're wearing the exact same thing. Nearly half of the male appearances were just Simon. In the interviews with costume designer Ellen Moroznik, so sorry if I've mispronounced your name, there is a lot of talk about making things fresh and modern, about colour and detail, the use of glitter and handmade flowers and jewels and all these wonderful exciting embellishments, and as we'll see, none of them appear on the men. The men of Bridgerton. There are 9 main male characters I'm going to be discussing, plus a bit about the background extras. I've chosen to completely ignore Gregory Bridgerton, even though he has an equivalent-sized role to some of the characters I will discuss, because he's a child. It's a different category of human entirely. The Bridgertons. We're going to talk about the 3 adult historical AU Jonas brothers, Anthony Benedict and Colin Bridgerton, in one breath, because frankly, they look exactly the same. No, genuinely, I'm not great with faces, and it took me 3 episodes before I could tell Anthony and Benedict apart. During the day they wear blue, and in the evenings they wear black coats and pale white or ivory waistcoats. In fact, almost every man seems to wear a black coat and pale waistcoat to evening events, which is a very late Victorian to mid-20th century aesthetic. The idea that evening wear for men should be black and ivory with very little variation or individuality is quite modern, and one we will come back to several times over the course of the video. There are a couple of variations when Benedict is getting in with the artistic types. We do see him wear some more yellow. Colin gets a maroon coat at least once and tends to wear lighter blues in general. In particular, I appreciated the full pale blue ensemble he wore when announcing his and Marina's short-lived engagement, which honestly was one of those moments where the costume department has so clearly kicked the door in and stated their intent. I think Anthony wears a dark aubergine at one point when he's riding with Daphne. It's hard to tell because it's a very brief scene and it's easy to miss the odd splash of colour when it's so overwhelmingly blue. Other than the monochromatic evening wear, I think it's important to point out that if you've established blue as your main colour, which, okay, yeah, all the Bridgertons wear blue, it's a theme, yellow is not the most obvious contrast colour. The most obvious contrast colour is orange, but we have white, cream and very rare splashes of yellow. That's another point I want to come back to. The Duke of Hastings. Simon comes next, not only as the male lead, but in that he has a very particular place in the visual narrative. He's got to look distinctly different from the Bridgertons, but still hot. The Bridgertons, including Daphne, wear blue and white, so he wears red and black. Literally going colour ABC here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As the male lead, Simon gets some of the biggest variation in his colour palette. We do see him wearing some different coloured coats in some scenes. There's a buff one and a silver one. He's the only man wearing red in some of the balls. In fact, he's the only man wearing colour in some of the balls. And he gets some of the most exciting fabrics. A lot of his coats have different textures of velvets, whereas everyone else seems to have mainly wool or plausibly wool. And while there's a couple of flash waistcoats around, it's Simon who's consistently wearing these brocades with metallic golds in them. I want you to hold Simon in your mind for a moment while we think about Prince Friedrich. Prince Friedrich. Let's start with reiterating these costumes are not historically accurate. That uniform is definitely not period correct at all, so a very conscious choice has been made here. The prince is supposed to be the other man. He's what Daphne could have if she decides against following her passions, and he's not only got to be a direct contrast to Simon, he's got to be, you know, tempting. He's designed to look approachable, not too ostentatious, but very manly, while still being, you know, nice. And you can clearly see he's in blue and silver, so he coordinated with the Bridgertons really nicely and contrasts very well against Simon. The prince could have been elaborate as all hell. Like, let's be clear, you've seen what the Queen is wearing. His uniform could have been dripping in silver embroidery. He could have had a different outfit each scene, and he doesn't. He's kind of plain. He's got a very specific, simple, unadorned kind of masculinity. He's rich, he's down to earth, he's a soldier, which is totally manly, right? And that never really gets any more three-dimensional. When you put the Bridgertons and Prince Friedrich next to Simon, or, you know, the white romantic leads versus the man of colour romantic lead, there's something a bit interesting when you compare how they're dressed. Not only does Simon get a larger colour palette and just more clothes, he wears more bling in general. The brooch he wears in every scene, and in particular these waistcoats, which are pretty explicitly non-European in origin. I don't feel qualified, for obvious reasons, to extrapolate too much on this subject, but it's definitely something I noticed. This is an analysis of two halves, and it's where things get spicy. The men I've talked about so far are the romantic leads. In short, they're the men you, the audience, are supposed to find attractive, and they're not that interesting to talk about because they're very similar, and quite frankly, kind of dull. So let's talk for a second about the men you're not supposed to be attracted to. Willmondrich. So it's hard to talk about Will's costumes because he doesn't usually wear a lot. And it's kind of misleading to say the audience isn't supposed to be attracted to Will. He's an exceptionally attractive, almost always shirtless man. He's strong, masculine, respectful of women, good with kids, but he's not a romantic lead. He's married and working class. And then he chooses to take the money and throw the boxing match while surrounded by landed gentry who only care about honour and reputation, which I don't like that the story did that. But this video is going to be long enough without getting into ingrained classism in Regency romance novels as well. He's wearing some very generic working class clothing in a couple of scenes, some Victorian-ish undershirts, basically what passes as a tight white t-shirt but looks kind of period. He appears at the Hastings ball at the very end, where again he's dressed like all the other men, because why would men's evening wear have variation? The only other remarkable scenes are extremely minor, but at the wedding he's the only man in red, as opposed to black or blue, and at the duel he's wearing tan. Simon's wearing red, Anthony and Benedict are in black and blue. It's that thing again where the black men are wearing more vivid and varied colour than the white men, and I can't tell whether it's intentional and another not very good attempt at drawing attention to race in the show, or if it's unintentional and just somebody's implicit bias showing? I mean, he's the only other significant man of colour in the show. He's working class, he's darker skinned than Simon, and he's usually shirtless. We see other male characters naked or semi-naked too, but not for the majority of their scenes. And let's be honest, usually with a scantily clad woman draped over them. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm not the person to do it, but I'm also not going to pretend it isn't there. In the context of a show about female desire, there's some objectification in play here that there isn't with the romantic leads, and it's not entirely comfortable. Nigel Burbrook. Potential suitor and literal toad in human form, Nigel Burbrook wears grey. That's basically it, grey. Black jacket in the evenings, obviously the odd touch of blue-green in a waistcoat, but mostly grey. I can't get enough full-length shots of men in the series to say for certain. It feels like they cut his jackets to make him look shorter and wider, but this is fine nuance. Honestly, the heavy lifting here is being done by those sideburns. Once you start looking at all the other men in the cast, you start noticing things like how Nigel's waistcoats are actually the exact same cut as Simon's, which is the exact same cut as half the waistcoats in this show, as unlike the women's dresses, which play around with shapes and cuts a surprisingly large amount given they're sticking to an empire waist, just compare Daphne and Lady Featherington and Penelope, the men's costumes are all kind of homogenous. I don't think that's the choice I would have made. I would have wanted Nigel's costumes to be distinct. Basically what I'm getting at here is there's literally nothing remarkable about Nigel's costumes at all, which kind of works. I would have been inclined to make him more loathsome than forgettable, but sure, we're not supposed to like him, let's not give us anything to like. Lord Featherington. I have a guilty admission to make. Lord Featherington's costumes are my favourite. So let's start with the obvious. Colour. Lord Featherington gets what no other speaking male role in this cast apparently gets: multiple colours that are not neutrals. I get yelled at every time I say this, so let me explain what I mean. White, black, cream, brown, grey, navy or dark blue, and most shades of red are what I would consider neutrals. That is to say, a colour that you can match with any other colour without too much effort. It's not a perfect system. Navy and black can be a bit funky. Brown and black you should probably think about at least a little bit. But mostly if you have a palette of just these colours, you can throw on basically anything in your wardrobe and it's going to work. Even if you introduce a single accent colour, like, to pick an entirely random example, gold or yellow, the outfit's still going to look balanced and you're probably not going to clash anything. Lord Featherington not only gets some excellent greens, which are paired with rich blue or yellow brown, he gets purple. Not a dark purple either, it's the full Cadbury's wrapper, with a yellow cravat, and he wears variations on these in multiple scenes, so he leaves an impression of being a man who wears colours. And they are astonishingly well chosen colours too. Multiple people have described these outfits to me as clashing, but they aren't. They're actually incredibly well balanced. If they were on a woman, we'd be celebrating these from the rooftops. Yellow is the perfect accent colour for purple. Their intensities are superbly complementary. And the outfit he wears to the garden party where Colin and Marina's engagement is announced, the trousers being the exact same blue as the brocade waistcoat but plain, and that grass green coat. So what's wrong here? Well, the problem is 50% Lord Featherington and 50% his wife. On the one hand, we aren't set up to like him. We know he's badly mismanaged the family fortune. He can't stand up for himself. When Portia confronts him about his gambling debts, he breaks down in tears. I wasn't about to go in for a third rewatch, so I can't say this for certain, but no other man in the series actually cries. They just brood. In short, Lord Featherington is presented as a failure, undesirable, unattractive. And then there's Lady Featherington. Throughout the series we are constantly subjected to Lady Featherington set dressing the people around her. She colour coordinates her daughters. She intermittently takes charge of dressing Marina, the country cousin. She's overbearing, she's controlling, she has actually a completely fine sense of colour, but not necessarily of dress, and certainly not of taste. Yeah, I know, taste is a classist construct, but this is for a modern audience. We don't have time to get into that right now. And then there's the garden party at the end of the first episode, where Portia, Lady Featherington, isn't in attendance. Right as Penelope explains that she could never wear a dress like this if her mother is around, she points out her father another who's wearing navy, just like all the other men. So he's not just weak and undesirable, he's the most unmasculine thing of all, henpecked. We're supposed to think his wife's choosing his clothes for him. Lord Featherington hasn't necessarily been dressed to be unattractive. We're being told he's not attractive, he's not a good match, he's not a romantic lead, and being expected to associate this with him being more extravagantly dressed because it shows how under his wife's control he is. But wait! Maybe we can save this! There's one other male character who kind of gets to wear colours. Henry Granville. In almost every scene he appears in, except for evening balls, which evening wear. Man with a profession instead of a personality, Henry Granville wears some variation on maroon and red. As I've previously pointed out, basically still a neutral, but the only other man regularly wearing red is Simon, so he stands out. And he's not a bad character. He's an artist, sure, but unlike Will, he's a titled member of society. He's clever and witty and pleasant, unlike Nigel, and we're not presented with an overbearing wife like Lord Featherington has, so we can believe it's his own choice in clothing. In fact, it's pretty clear that he's sexually involved with another man. Right, cool, yeah, great, awesome, yes, fine. I'm back with reinforcements. So to recap, a male character is depicted as visually different from all the other speaking male characters because he's wearing a colour, not even a particularly unusual colour, like it's maroon. Lots of modern men's clothing is maroon. There's some other maroon jackets that appear on other characters, but no one else goes for fully maroon, waistcoat, trousers and all. He is made to clearly visually stand out, particularly from the other important men, basically by not wearing blue, and he's the only queer character in the show. So I don't want to get too off track. You're here for the costumes and I totally get that. But even if this was a good depiction of a queer man in a work of fiction, which it 100% is not, colour coding your gaze is a bit weird. I said before that Lord Featherington isn't dressed to be unattractive. We're told he's unattractive and also he's visually distinct. Kind of the same thing is happening here. It's more subtle for sure. Henry stands out from the other men, but only if you're looking for it. And indeed you might not even realise why he looks different from the other characters. You just clock that he did. Terrible metaphors for sexuality aside, and I really can't double down enough on how weird, predictable and disappointing Henry's extremely minor plot thread is. Okay, no, can we just go back to all the stuff that's never explored in any way, like we never actually get to talk to his marriage of convenience spouse because she only gets one speaking line in the whole series. He says he loves a guy in a conversation to someone else entirely when we never speak to that guy at all either. We don't even see them actually be intimate with each other in a romantic way. We just get one weird voyeuristic fragment of a sex scene mid-housewide artistic bacchanal because what else would a gay man in society be doing except promoting sexual excess and the downfall of class boundaries in which we don't see the other guy's face at all? I hate basically everything about this. But let's get back to the costumes for a second. All of the significant romantic leads, the men that you, the audience, are supposed to find attractive, are fairly homogenous. There are some minor variations, but they wear the same styles and, more importantly, the same colours. The nice boys wear blue, the bad boy wears blood red and black. Based on the wardrobes of these characters, they could get dressed in the dark and probably still look just as good, because they only have this incredibly limited neutral palette. Even the boys who wear blue get one accent colour, yellow, which is the toned down soft version of what their accent colour should be, because, I don't know, is orange just a step too far? Too brash? Too obvious? Too notice me, I'm a follower of fashion? And then the men who are wearing colours that they might actually have had to think about, that is to say the men who have visibly paid attention to or had someone think about their clothes, are either being dominated by their overbearing wife or are attracted to men. And it's leading me to the conclusion that the creators of Bridgerton are expecting their, remember, overwhelmingly female and attracted to men audience to see men dressing outside of a very narrow norm, associate that with femininity, and conclude that they are unmanly and thus unattractive. I think this becomes even more obvious when you start looking at the background characters, who are by and large more colourfully dressed. There's lots of purples, reds and greens going on in the background, not to mention the fantastically colour-coded footmen in their livery, because we're building up this fresh, bright, high fashion inspired world that the costume designers envisioned. We're just not seeing it on the main characters, and the distinction here does seem to be that those extras are not supposed to be attractive. They're not there for us to get invested in or have feelings about, they're just there to make things look right. So why does this matter? But wait, I can pretty much hear you cry through the magic of YouTube. The primary audience for this show is women. Women who find men attractive. Why is it weird that the main male characters are men who have been made to be attractive to women? Because the template of an attractive man that this show offers is not only incredibly limited and restrictive, it's not actually representative of female desire. And it's gone the direct opposite direction to how they've chosen to design the women's costumes. Let's talk about trousers, because apparently every man in this show wears trousers. Again, not historically accurate, a conscious choice. In fact, fact, the only men we see at all in breeches and stockings are attendants to the Queen, and again, distinctly associated with femininity, in this case, overbearing femininity. When designing the women's clothing, for example, their undergarments, Bridgerton decided to make things as sexy as possible. Corsets with no chemises, pantaloons, which, yes, are sexier than petticoats, because there's a visible divide between the legs instead of nebulous skirts, which is kind of interesting in the context of a largely female and attracted to men audience, but sexism! We don't have time. However, it would seem logical that if that's what they're doing the men's trousers, okay, we can accept they're going to wear trousers because that's what a modern audience expects, would be more fitted. And they're not. When men's bodies are objectified in Bridgerton, which, let's be clear, they are, it's naked, so we can admire their very developed muscles and surprisingly smooth skin, rather than using the clothing to make them look sexy. We don't even get a full Colin Firth in the BBC's 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which frankly, in any even vaguely Regency-themed adaptation, should be illegal. Men's clothes aren't used in the series to accentuate their bodies, just cover them, and as previously stated, most of the attractive male leads have been dressed to look as much as possible like they haven't thought about their clothes at all. Men who clearly have something wrong with them. Are you beginning to see why this made me kind of uncomfortable? Hell, only one male character in the series properly cries, and it's presented as part and parcel of the most unmanly thing that has ever happened. Not only has he failed to provide for his family, but he has no idea how to solve the issue and must beg his wife for help. This is toxic masculinity 101. The idea that there's only one very specific way to be a man and to be attractive to women, and it involves not wearing colours, not being unique or creative except in very specific non-feminine ways, repressing your feelings, having a very idealised body but without letting anyone know that you took effort to have that body. And it's nothing new that romance novels are reinforcing a very narrow idea of what romance and desire looks like, it's just that it's the year of our Lord 2021 and Bridgerton was supposed to be fresh and new and an innovative take on the genre. I'm not trying to say that the romantic leads in Bridgerton are the worst, TM. Actually, compared to a lot of romantic options thrown at young women, they're pretty wholesome. Literally none of them have stalked, isolated, or violently tried to control their partner's every action, and yes, I know that is a low bar, but most of the time we don't even clear that. And it's presented as romantic. Given the choice between Simon and, I don't know, Edward Cullen? Simon every day of the week. They are better, they're just not that much better. Okay, but why does this actually matter? Let's assume we're all complex creatures, and even if we are attracted to men, we're not going to let our entire romantic and gender experience be shaped by a Netflix show. Toxic masculinity is something we can recognise and expand beyond. Bridgerton has had an impact on the costuming community unlike anything I have seen since early seasons of Game of Thrones? Maybe Outlander? We're yet to see if it has legs, but it hasn't debuted, it's exploded. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about my experiences in costuming communities over about a decade as 3 different genders. If you're thinking to yourself, but there's only 2 genders, you know I had a whole bit written about how I don't have time to explain that gender is a spectrum, but actually, no, I have time. There are more than 2 genders. That's it. That's the whole explanation. There's not even an opinion, it's literally a fact. There's tons of historical as well as contemporary evidence from basically every culture that there has ever been. If that's new information for you, awesome! You learned something! But isn't that why you watch YouTube videos for learning new things? Gender is complex and wibbly and all over the place, and always has been. It's wild. Where were we? Here's the thing about costuming communities. In general, unless explicitly stated otherwise, everyone assumes female is default. I want to be really clear, I'm not in any way against spaces created for and by women, even when those spaces explicitly excluded me. Those spaces should exist. If you don't understand why they exist, you have literally millennia of history to catch up on. It should also go without saying that those spaces should be trans-inclusive, but apparently this is something that needs constantly repeating in small words for the people at the back. But costuming communities, while largely created and filled by women, also generally welcome and are happy to celebrate people who don't identify as women. They're just not always great at doing that in a non-explicitly gendered way. And even now when people are more understanding of non-binary identities, the communities I'm involved with are by and large massively more chill than the places I was hanging out in as a teenager and 20-something, and most people I interact with know my pronouns. They, them. Thank you for asking. There's still a whole bunch of assumptions that just show up on a regular basis. If I mention that I'm making an 18th century project, I will get questions about petticoats and stays. Literally nobody will consider that I might be making men's clothing unless I actively state that's what it is. And people will rarely get excited about men's clothing or talk about feeling inspired to join in the way they do when you're making a corset or gown. Because why would you? Men's clothing is difficult and boring. Obviously you're making a woman's costume. If I visibly do traditionally feminine things, nobody will notice, or if they do, they're unlikely to comment. The same is not generally true of people who explicitly identify as male, and it wasn't in my personal experience. Yes, I am hyper aware that the fact you don't comment is because you all assume I'm female. thanks for noticing. It's fine, really. Don't overthink it. People not commenting on my hair and nails except to ask where I got that colour from is the preferred state of existence for me. Now, full disclaimer. Experiences of a trans-masculine person and experiences of a cis man are almost certainly not the same thing. Also, my experience of being in costuming communities while identifying as male was almost exclusively limited to online spaces due to, well, the way I look and talk. And it was some years ago, and it was mostly cosplay back then, which at the time attracted a slightly interesting demographic. And being raised female gives you an extremely heightened awareness of when people are maybe slightly creepily kind of hitting on you. While I'm sure things have got better, being a man in costuming spaces was, for me, a basically endless parade of being put on a weird pedestal and being slightly creepily hit on. It's a time! So aside from being disproportionately celebrated for things women were visibly doing and doing much better than me, including, you know, wearing jewellery, having makeup, having nice nails and skin, speaking eloquently, being overly polite, things that people would seemingly never point out when women did it, things that nobody ever commented on when I was identifying as female, but literally always seemed to comment on when someone masculine presenting did. And aside from the fact that people still assumed that I would want to make women's clothing at some point, yes, that's a point we're going to come back to, people, largely women, also felt comfortable saying some kind of weird things to me that it was clear they didn't necessarily feel comfortable saying to non-costuming guys. As conversational openers with strangers go, gosh, I'd like to put you in a corset is a choice! But for me it comes back to the assumption of feminine as default. Presenting male in a costuming space, a space that was and honestly still is overwhelmingly female, marked me out as other and different and kind of objectifiable, but also led to assumptions that not only was I interested in feminine things, I was explicitly up for making and wearing women's clothing. The fact that for some people this was clearly a thing they were into was kind of secondary. Aside from the fact that that's a really problematic attitude to project onto a trans man in particular, it was repeatedly explicitly reinforced that more than the gender of the participants, women's costume was the norm. Because women's clothing was just better. It was easier, it was better documented, and it was more interesting, more creative, more colourful, more forgiving. It had a more interesting fit. You didn't have to learn tailoring, which was obviously an actual skilled profession that only actual professionals could do, not amateurs. You couldn't just learn it from a book or YouTube video. There were no resources. Men's clothing was difficult, and that difficulty wasn't worth it because it was also boring. It was something you kind of couldn't do, and that you obviously wouldn't want to. So how does Bridgerton fit into this? Bridgerton has inspired people. There are folks who would never have thought about getting into historical costuming, people who were intimidated by all the research and sources and period techniques, looking at the Bridgerton costumes and going, actually I think I want to give this a go. They haven't just made Regency costume bright and exciting and creative and modern, they've made it accessible. They've opened up a door to the idea that maybe you don't have to do everything original practice, counted stitches, Bernadette Banner will be disappointed in you if you don't do enough research. And that's thrown open the double doors of the horizon to a whole new set of people who suddenly want to make costumes and have fun doing it. And they've literally only done it for the women. Because all men wear the same thing, in the same colours, and it's really hard to make, so why would you bother? Now I am very aware that all along I've said that Bridgerton's main audience is women, and it makes complete sense that they would want to mostly appeal to women. But we are never going to get more non-women into the hobby. We are never going to shake the association of costume being a girl thing that boys shouldn't care about. We are never going to stop objectifying non-women in costuming as kind of feminine, or assuming that straight cis guys who want to sew are rare exotic curiosities, until TV shows and movies and whatever else stop doing this. We're never even going to get people of all genders branching out into making historical men's clothing, learning and sharing the techniques involved, and building up the depth of resources that there currently only is for historical women's clothing. And we're also going to continue reinforcing the idea that there's a specific box labelled sufficiently manly man. If you step outside it, you're weird and feminine and unattractive, or maybe special and feminine and available for being creepily hit on in costuming message boards. We can do better, and we can demand better from the media we consume. And now I'm going to go, I don't know, sew handmade flowers onto a waistcoat or something? That is a hard sentence to say. Why did I lead with that? Oh, hello. Particularly in the... I'm going to do that line again because I fluffed it. The window bird feeder was a better idea before I picked this as a filming position. Video are playing female characters. Thursday, go away. Oh, and I didn't clap. Is this the worst idea? No, cool. Thursday, go away. The techniques involved and building up the depth of resources that there currently only is for historical women's clothing.